Anyway, so I usually have the title of scientist, but I hang around with a lot of others. And back in 2012, when we had the 12th International Coral Reef Symposium in Australia, I was the president of the International Society for Reef Studies at the time. They were casting around for a place to hold the next Coral Reef Symposium, and it just shows that there's a disconnect between education and intelligence, because I agreed that I would host the International Coral Reef Symposium here in Hawaii, which we did in 2016, on one condition, and that condition was that we made the theme bridging science to policy and knowledge to action. And so my scientific colleagues kind of looked at me askance and said, why would we do that? We're a bunch of scientists. We don't do policy. We don't do these other things. We do research. And I pointed out to them, and if we ever get the slides up, I did a quick view of the literature. And in 2016, there were 18,500 publications on corals and coral reefs. So I actually went back to 1969, the first International Coral Reef Symposium, and went from 5,000 in the previous 4 years to 38,000 in the last 4 years. So our knowledge base has been going up logarithmically, and I asked my colleagues, how are coral reefs doing? If you did the same trajectory, reefs have been going down logarithmically. So I said, all right, if we're learning more about reefs than ever before, and they're in worse shape than they were ever before, how do we reconcile that? And they said, I know, why don't we make the next symposium bridging science to policy and knowledge to action? So it worked. And so from it, we decided to pull together a Leaders Summit to make it more than just scientists talking to scientists. We broadened the net that we cast to include lawyers, policymakers, managers, educators. And as part of it, we were able to get together, thanks to the support from Jennifer Koss, Eric Koh that was here, Castle Foundation, and others, to be able to bring 3 presidents from the Pacific Islands, President Remengesau from Palau, President Heine from the Marshalls, and President Christian from the Federated States of Micronesia, and hold a separate Leaders Summit as part of the symposium, because we had over 2,500 individuals from 97 nations, figuring that we really needed to open up this dialogue a little bit better. And lo and behold, we got the presidents to come together on issues of how do we better put science to work in supporting the needs of the people who depend on it. So from the very beginning, those of us involved in corals and coral reefs, through the Coral Reef Task Force and through the All Islands Committee, I see a lot of my colleagues here, it's always been not about just coral reefs, but the people who depend on them. And for that reason, if you look at what's going on, it's the people who depend on reefs, but it's also people that are the biggest concern affecting coral reefs. And again, when we talk about coral reef management, it's not about managing corals. They're going to do whatever they damn well please, or whatever they're evolutionarily programmed to do. The best we can hope for is to manage those human activities responsible for coral damage, including things like sewage and other activities. So with this in mind, I'm not there yet, we were able to get a very good judge who is actually there we go, the Supreme Court Justice from the Federated States of Micronesia, Chief Justice Dennis Yamase, who is also a graduate from the Richardson School of Law. I met him in a court of law. I was not a defendant. I was an expert witness, and it was actually using NOAA-funded research. A ship ran aground, spilled 85,000 gallons of fuel oil, and it was tobacco industry 101. Yes, our ship ran aground. Yes, we spilled 85,000 gallons of fuel oil, and corals died, but you can't prove that it was our oil. And the answer to that was, oh, yes, we can. And so we put our NOAA-funded research to work, and we were able to do 2 things in the court of law. One is demonstrate that the oil was responsible for the coral death, and that those corals actually had a value, and that value could be done in dollars and cents. And if anybody wants it, I've got all the law stuff to go with it. But it was an interesting experience, and when I asked Judge Yamase if he would be willing to come to this Coral Reef Symposium and speak, especially to the leaders, he said, why would you want a judge to come talk at a scientific meeting? And I explained it, and he said, oh, okay. And at the time I didn't know, but he had been the legal counsel to President Remengesau when he was vice president, so there was a good connection. And he laid out a scenario for the 3 chief executives saying 3 ship groundings within the last year. 1 in the Marshalls, 1 in the FSM, and 1 in Palau. The 1 in the Marshalls dismissed with prejudice because no one had standing. The 1 in Yap, $2.9 million in restitution to the people of Yap. That's science at work. And in Palau, they had no laws whatsoever, so they finally got them on clearing and grading without a permit. So the best they could do is to say that the ship graded the reef, that they didn't have a permit to do that, and that wasn't even a slap on the wrist. That was like a gentle caress of the cheek. And so the three presidents are sitting there going, seriously? And Yamase said yes. So that's when we got together. We had a really interesting meeting. Here's that curve. The first Coral Reef Symposium, about 3,000 publications in the first 4 years. By the 12th International Coral Reef Symposium, 34. We're up to about 38,000 to 40,000 publications over a 4-year period. And this is a time when coral reefs have taken a nosedive like we've never seen before. So at this, we were able to get a call to action from the three chief executives, as President Ramingasau on the left and President Heine on the right. President Christian was off and about somewhere. But what we were able to do was get them to give us the guidance to say, look, we really need to change the way in which we're doing things. And with the understanding of the independence of the three branches of government, we really have to coordinate better. Otherwise, there's no hope for reefs and the people who depend on them. So we were sent to go forward, and they said, look, the legislature is going to be the weak spot. And we kind of agree because that's where the laws come from. And for those of you that know much more about law than I do, you don't need new laws every time you want to change the netting on a fish net, or the amount of sediment in the water, or the quantity of organophosphate pesticides that can be in the water. You can do a 90-day administrative rule if the law exists and be able to empower the executive branch agency with a mandate to make those changes. The problem is that so many of the underlying laws are so weak that it's very hard to be able to take these things to court and actually win even weaknesses in the definitions. So the next group we went to was the Pacific Judicial Council. Some of you may be familiar with it, Ninth Circuit Court. We had representatives from 7 different Pacific islands. We had about 100 judges and justices, attorneys general, prosecutors there. David Sakota was there, thanks to David, and Mike, and we had Jason was there. We had a lot of good people. And the idea there was to see if we could work with the courts, and it was very interesting. Dennis Yamase took the legal side. I worked on the science and technical side. We had support from Department of Defense. We had really good people from the U.S. Navy. Part of it was to point out that we had new tools that could be in the courtroom, but we needed, again, to make this a partnership. So trial by fire, I've learned about things like Daubert rule, and I've learned about things like chain of custody, and all those things that no scientist should ever have to learn, but did. And I basically said, you know, we have all these new tools we can do. So he sat down, it was like ordering off a menu in a Chinese restaurant. I sat down with Justice Yamase and 3 or 4 other justices and said, here's a list of things we can do. For example, on IUU, illegal, unreported, undocumented fishing, we can do environmental DNA now. So if you get a fishing boat, we can scoop water out of the bilge, we can do the environmental DNA, and we can tell you everything that was on the boat. So you don't need to find a whale carcass, you don't need to find an endangered species of turtle. We can go in and get the DNA, but if you can't use it in court, then this tool is not going to be valuable to you. And their eyes lit up, said, you can do that? And I said, yeah, if you can use DNA for a murder, why can't you do it for IUU? And they got really excited. The issue about large-scale marine protected areas came up, but Marshall Islands said, look, our EEZ is so huge, how could we ever do anything? Well, there's drones, there's satellite imagery, there's a variety of tools that can be used. In the olden days, the Navy representative said, yeah, we could tell you, but we'd have to kill you. Now they've gotten a much broader view, and I see colleagues here from the Coast Guard. And they said, no, we're dying to make this data available. And with port states measures agreements, if someone's illegally fishing in your EEZ, we can provide the data. If they go to Fiji, you can arrest the vessel, and with port states measures, you can bring them to bear. So they got really excited about that. So long story short, we had this meeting at Guam in November with 100 members of the judiciary, and it was one of the most interesting meetings I've ever been to. David and others can comment on it as well. But it was a really interesting meeting in terms of, at first, the judges and justices not quite sure about environmental science in general. And by the end of the meeting, you know, we talked to them, what would you like as a deliverable? We got a call to action from the 3 presidents. I said, are you guys interested in something like that? They're going, well, you know, judges aren't usually activists, so we're not sure we want it. By Wednesday, we're damn right we do. We want a call to action. And by Friday, we actually got something far stronger than I would have expected. And if anyone's interested, I have copies of all this as well. But they agreed to that they really needed to partner not only with the executive branch but with the legislature. And it was interesting because the Speaker of the Guam legislature had previously been a judge for the Guam courts. And he said, look, you guys have no shame in coming over to the legislature when you need funding. You should really do the same thing with the laws. So from that discussion and from the outputs we had there, the third leg was going to the legislature, and this last month there was a meeting of the Association of Pacific Island Legislators in Pohnpei, in which Pew sponsored a workshop on ocean health and marine protected areas. I was asked to speak to them as well, and a lot of the legislators got very excited and interested about it as well. So what's interesting to me then as a scientist who, I think my official title is still pet scientist for a variety of different groups, and we came to several conclusions about, where do we go from here? It was very clear that the present laws, regulations, the context in which we can use this information has not kept up with the science. And it's true. I mean, things that we couldn't have even thought of 5 years ago, like environmental DNA, some of the technology now for remote surveillance, the things that we can use in proving cause and effect relationships between stressors and damage have gone beyond anything we had before, but the laws don't allow us to effectively bring that science into the courtroom. So the challenges have mounted, the knowledge is there, but we still haven't built the appropriate bridges, and that's something we need to do. Being able to bring the three branches of government together, respecting that they are independent, but also recognizing that if the three branches of government do not work effectively, if the legislators won't pass the appropriate laws, the executive branch agencies with the mandate can't do their job, and then the managers and the enforcement people can't do theirs either. And so we discussed various options about it. And again, I was in a different world for me, but when talking to the justices, and in the case of the court case we did in Yap, I had the advantage that Chief Justice Yamase is not only a judge and a justice, but he had an environmental science background. And for that reason, I could pitch the science up here, and he understood everything. And their scientific experts for the defendants knew nothing. And so it was one of the only times I can say I had an enjoyable experience in a court of law, because the judge got everything and their experts knew nothing because they weren't experts. And so the bottom line was, I said, I know that you have things called masters. You have a master's on engineering. If a bridge collapses, could you have a master's in coral reef science or fisheries or ocean health? And they kind of looked at me and go, I don't see why not. So they even said there was an example, they had a master for Southern culture. There was some kind of Hatfield and McCoy thing that went on. So they had someone certified as a master in Southern culture. I won't go there, but in any case, if they could have a master of Southern culture, I would argue you could definitely have a master for coral reef biology. And finally, to say that the only way that there's hope, and I do believe there's hope, otherwise I wouldn't keep doing what I'm doing, is to really do a better job for the scientific community to really make the effort to bridge their science to policy. And when I say knowledge to action, it's in deference to traditional ecological knowledge, that there's a great deal of solid information there, there's good science, but traditional ecological knowledge didn't have to deal with things like nuclear detonations. I spent 2 years at Enewetak Atoll, with organophosphate pesticides, with the roving fleets of poaching fishing vessels that we've never seen before. So it's a different world, but we need to take a different approach. And in conclusion, simply say these partnerships between the legislative branch, the judicial branch, the executive branch is really important for the next generation of up-and-coming scientists. To actually teach a graduate seminar in communicating science, and I do a section on doing science in a courtroom. I always tell people it's the worst place in the world to do it, but if good scientists aren't willing to do science in a courtroom, a lot of bad scientists are. And so that's kind of a quick summary of an effort over the last 2 years to try to reach out to all three branches. It's still a process ongoing, but we're making good headway, and I think there's plenty of room for lots of people to get engaged in it. And if you're so interested, please let me know. Thanks very much.
There must be questions. There must be questions for Dr. Bob, I'm sure.
Hi. Hey, you were talking about, the conference that you went to in 2017 and you were talking about the conference in 2017 and the enthusiasm of legislators in some of the things that science can do today to help prove some of these cases. Do you know if there's been any follow-up in terms of draft legislation in some of these some of these countries in the Pacific?
Absolutely. And so again, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's some very good models out there. So we've been working together to try to put together a package of existing laws that are good models from which to work, where it could easily be modified for local culture, for a local community, for local laws that exist. But in other cases, we've actually reached out, and Denise and I have talked about this before, and I know you had one that was working, the FSM, I believe, yeah. Yeah. And so there are discussions about trying to get legal interns into some of these jurisdictions to be able to do that and be that translation. We had really good support from people within the U.S. Coral Reef Task Force. Again, we actually had a lot of support from the Justice Department from the U.S. It turned out that one of the people we worked with on the IUU was Assistant Attorney General in Palau. So he had to send one of his people down to the meeting. So there is an ongoing effort to, number one, put together a library of what already exists, and then to look at existing legislation and to try to draft things that are new. But again, that's an area in which we could really use help. The scientists, I've been able to cajole a number of my colleagues into being on the science side. We're still a little bit light on the judicial side.
So how about here in Hawaii? Maybe we should ask Dean Antolini, how about here in Hawaii? Yeah, if you don't mind, Dean Antolini, I'll ask you.
Sherry,
do you think that the laws are up to date in terms of the kind of science that's available to prove some of these cases?
Short answer is no. I actually think overall we have very, very good laws, but I don't think the laws do a good job keeping up with science. I mean, I just was reflecting about the drone surfing. Who put that up? Todd, right? And and same thing with co-management, community-based co-management. I think, Western law, which we have struggled to integrate with traditional law in Hawaii, as you know, it's a challenge. I wouldn't say it's a struggle, it's a challenge. One of the challenges is that rulemaking is so rigid and statutes are so rigid, and it takes so darn long to change them. And they don't keep up. And so Ha'ena, I think, is a great example where the idea was to try to get rules that were more flexible, where you could have real-time management, more iterative, to try to go back to traditional concepts of real-time on-the-ground management. But getting the traditional 55-step rulemaking process to speak to how fast science is developing and integrating with traditional knowledge, which is real-time knowledge, I think we're not there yet. So the answer is no, we're not there yet. We need help. We need great assistance from our adjunct faculty and our upcoming law students.
I'll just make one more comment to that. The judicial group was so pleased with this effort that they've offered to put together a working group, and that's what we have right now. It's kind of ad hoc, and sometimes that's the best. But they were interested in putting together a group of judges and justices, attorneys general and prosecutors, with some scientists and members of the legislature, to do it as a group, rather than have each group work on it independently, to do it kind of in a cohesive fashion and move it forward more quickly. So we've already been doing follow-up with it, and I was actually overwhelmed with the response we got. I wasn't expecting that at all. And I didn't get thrown into jail either, so that was a good sign.
Last question. Hi, Dr. Richmond. So first off, I just want to say congratulations for everything you're doing. I came from the UOG Marine Lab, and so did my colleague sitting to my left, so hats off to you for all the good work. So I'm just going to ask the question I really want to ask. You mentioned something about putting a dollar value to some of this destructive benthic habitat from some of these ship groundings.
Yep.
And that was actually presented in case law, correct?
Correct.
So because it's already been presented in the courts, and we kind of need to maintain a consistent ruling, is that something that's going to be applied to all geographic locales, or is it just specific for that particular region?
No, hopefully, and that's the reason I took on the case, that I really don't like being a scientist in the court of law, but occasionally you see these cases that have much greater opportunity for setting precedent, and I knew this would be a precedent-setting case for the Pacific Islands, so that's why I spent a lot of time on it. It's in case law. It went through 3 appeals, and we knew it would, and I knew it had to be tighter than tight. It went through all 3 appeals, and it upheld in court, and of course the insurance company, the club, who insures all the maritime activity, pulled out all the stops. I mean, they did everything, and I've learned about being a hostile witness. I've learned about being a very, very, very hostile witness. And so the bottom line is it held up. So I'm a biologist by training, but I work with a very well-renowned economist, and we're working on a publication now to show the advancing, just like biological sciences have advanced, so has economic science. And so the two of us are working on kind of an update into alternatives for coral reef valuation exactly for that purpose, that it's in published, we meet the Daubert rule, and it can be applied much more broadly. So that's hopefully will be out. Our plan is to try to get it into publication by January.
It just seems like there's other intangibles that might not have been considered in that specific case law. For example, reef rugosity, which actually increases coral sediment. So those are kind of metrics that don't necessarily deal with physically removing the coral, but actually induce coral sediment.
Correct.
So those are some of the intangibles that I was kind of alluding to.
So having Justice Yamase part of it was really helpful. Once it went through 3 appeals, I reached out to him and said I didn't want to create a conflict, but would he be willing to give me feedback on what he found compelling so that I would know when I'm teaching my seminar of what to do next? And he was absolutely wonderful, saying these arguments worked, these didn't. And there is no Kelly Blue Book for coral reefs. It's not like, your 2013 Honda. If someone rams into the side, if someone shears your reef, you can't go to the Kelly Blue Book. So I gave 3 different alternatives and explained the one why I thought it was appropriate here, and he found that argument compelling. So again, the quality of the science moving forward is there. We have good precedent, but there's more work to be done.
It's just interesting because now the way we see it, it's kind of evolving to where, we're going to have all of these micro environmental laws, if you will, to sort of suit all of our needs across the Pacific. And it's not just one blanket law that's going to solve all our issues, because obviously, we're very diverse island nations, and I just don't see anything blanket working for the area we live in.
All right, thanks for your comments. Thanks, Dr. Bob.